Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we look at the ghost ships of Australia. From the very beginning of the European settlement here in Australia, we've had ships coming and going every which way from everywhere. From the wreck of the HMS Sirius, one of the first fleet, though it wasn't on the journey to Australia, but from Australia to Norfolk Island, where this ship was wrecked on the reef just outside Norfolk Island. Even the second fleet had trouble with ships. We did a story about it a year ago called the Death Fleet, the Neptune, the Scarborough and the Surprise. But it was no surprise at the way they were treated back in the day, how anyone could have survived those ghastly trips, especially being stuck below deck, with soldiers and rifles ready to shoot you if you even thought about escaping. Oftentimes in leg irons. It's no wonder any of those convicts that came from England and various other places even survived the journey to get to Australia, let alone getting here and being hung for heaven knows what. Well, we've told most of those stories, so go and have a look. But the Death Fleet was just the beginning of countless ships who lost their way, crashed against the shores, and just went missing. All on the trip to Australia. We've got a couple of those stories for you, and some of them are quite ghostly. The first story begins with a convict ship, George III, which left London in 1835 carrying 308 passengers on board. 200 of these were convicts, and 40 of those convicts were young boys. They were male convicts on this ship, along with 108 crew members and their families included. They were en route to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania. They had a terrible voyage that started off pretty awful. Originally, they met with foul weather. Then a fire broke out that was apparently caused by an open flame and liquor. The details never really surfaced for that. And then it was wild weather again, little rations for the convicts. When the captain decided not to stop at several places, the convicts were getting low on food, and this meant that many of them died of scurvy before they even got to the disastrous channel. In the last leg of the voyage, to escape more bad weather, they decided to go through the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, which led up to Hobart out of the open water. It must have been attempted before, so they didn't think they'd have any trouble, but it was shallow, running them aground and cracking the hull, and in turn tipped the boat over. All of the dead were convicts, and this was because they drowned inside an iron cage that was in the lower section of the ship. Despite the heroic efforts of the convicts to escape the iron cage and scramble up on deck, they were met with gunfire from the soldiers, who shot 3 of them dead. It is also believed that a couple of these convicts had actually helped save them from the fire they had encountered earlier on the voyage. Eventually the soldiers let them up on deck, the survivors who made it out of the cage that weren't drowned. There was a small boat on board the ship that was used to go and get help from Hobart. When they got back sometime later, most of the survivors were standing on the ship, which is now on its side. And then the worst happened. The ship sunk. There have been many stories about this ship. One of the soldiers' wives who were on board had recently had twins, and one of the stories goes that she was breastfeeding 2 of these children at once while the storm was carrying on, and had a third child between her knees, protecting him or her from the violent storm. Another version of the story went that while she was breastfeeding her twins, it wasn't another one of her children at her knee, but she was actually hiding one of the boy convicts who had scrambled up on deck after escaping from the iron jail. She was saving the poor boy from being shot, and apparently he was the only boy survivor on the ship. So there's a couple of little stories going on there. Most of the George wreck is at the bottom of the ocean. South of Southport Bluff, there is a monument dedicated to those who perished in the wreck. Some of the timber from the wreck washed up ashore, and it is believed that that timber was used in erecting the government house domain at Hobart, used for the clock tower that's still there today. And it is believed that the George III ship still sails through the D'Entrecasteaux Channel to this very day. If you thought these shipwrecks would have deterred passengers from getting on board, well, you'd be wrong. I suppose it's like us now with flying. We've seen so many of those air crash investigator episodes of things going wrong, but we still happily board a plane when we need to go on our holidays. They did finish up sending convicts over in the 1850s, but also in the 1850s was one of the worst maritime disasters in Sydney at that time. But this next shipwreck, or ghost ship, was the Dunbar. A fine ship built in the Deptford Yard of England. It was used as a troop ship and a transport ship originally, but was later, toward the end of its life, used as a passenger ship to Australia. It was somewhat of a luxurious ship, you could say, built of British oak and East Indian teak. They spared no expense on this one, but sadly, like other ships, she ended up on the bottom of the ocean. The captain of the Dunbar was James Green, and it wasn't his first time sailing to Sydney, and he'd actually made successful trips into Sydney Harbour about 8 times before. So he didn't think much of getting into the harbour. But on this particular night, the 20th of August 1857, the weather was particularly rotten, which is becoming a common theme in these shipwrecks, and there was very little lighting at the heads, the north and south heads that open up into the harbour from the ocean, and he wasn't able to really see where he was going. And in those days they relied heavily on maps and people with heavy torchlight looking out, having a look to see if it was safe to go ahead. At one point he decides, instead of waiting the storm out and entering the heads in the morning, that it would be better for them just to make for the land. So they turned left into what they believed to have been Port Jackson or Sydney Harbour. However, at the last minute, they realised that they were turning into the rock face of the South Head. There was nothing that they could do. Despite trying to turn out, they were going too fast, and with the power of the waves, crashed into the rocks below, ripping a hole in the hull. The area in which they crashed into is called the Gap, or known as the Gap now. And this particular spot is quite an eerie location, not only because the Dunbar crashed head first into it, but many souls have taken their lives over the edge of the cliff face. It is known in Sydney for that very reason, and so it has become a spot that is cursed with many deaths, and many souls linger in this spot where they met their end. There was a man named Don Ritchie who, together with his family, lived above the Gap. Don spent 50 years saving hundreds and hundreds of people from jumping to their deaths, offering coffee, hope, and an ear to listen to them. He was awarded a Hero's Honour in 2011. Sadly, he passed away in 2012 at the age of 86. The man was truly an angel. But back to the Dunbar. Of the 59 crew and 63 passengers, there was only one survivor, an able seaman by the name of James Johnson. As the ship smashed against the rocks, cargo and human cargo or passengers were also thrown from the ship, and James Johnson was thrown against the rocks. However, he was able to latch onto the rocks. He would be the only survivor of the Dunbar. It was a terrible occasion. The next morning, Sydney-siders woke to find people, cargo, just bodies everywhere in the harbour and on the beaches. They knew a ship had met its end, but they didn't know, out of the many that were scheduled into Port Jackson over the coming week, which ship it was. On further investigation, many of the items that had broken off the ship gave up its answer. Things were listed as the Dunbar, and it wasn't too long before they realised who were on board and what had happened. They would have got most of the answers from poor James Johnson had they found him at that time. Unfortunately, the poor man clung to the edge of the rocks for 36 hours after the event before anybody had noticed him. It was the salvagers going to the boat to see if they could bring it back that noticed him clinging for his life. Hungry, cold and wet, probably suffering from hypothermia, being August in winter, it's no wonder he was able to stay alive as long as he did. James went on to become an assistant lighthouse keeper at Nobby's Beach in Newcastle, where he actually saved a sole survivor from the SS Kawara, 1866. So not even 10 years later, the sole survivor of one ship saves or is helped to rescue the sole survivor of another ship. James lived for the rest of his days in the Newcastle area, dying at 78. He's buried at Sandgate Cemetery, where some of my people are. There was a day of mourning when all of the bodies were buried. Some were not identified and were placed in a tomb in Camperdown, and a monument erected at the gap with the anchor that was later found in 1910. The anchor and the memorial plaque were erected at the gap in 1930. But the strange thing in 1857, after this ship had crashed on the rocks, was only a month later when another ship crashed on the North Head. There was insufficient light at night at the opening of Port Jackson. This was the Catherine Adamson, and as a result of both of these ships crashing and such a great loss of life, they have finally erected a lighthouse. The Hornby Lighthouse was erected at the tip of the South Head. And yes, the ships still kept coming. With such a great loss of life at this particular location, it's any wonder there isn't ghosts constantly circling and swarming at this position. People taking their lives from the top, and the people who perished at the bottom in the Dunbar. It is very known for its haunting and eeriness. The ship has also been known as Australia's Titanic. And if you venture off the heads, be sure to look out for the Dunbar and the Catherine Adamson. They may still be trying to attempt to get into Sydney Harbour. For our next story, we take you to 1911, which was almost a year before the Titanic sunk in 1912. It was the 15th of April 1912 when that fateful day for the Titanic hit an iceberg and sunk. Well, it's debatable. Many believe there was a fire in the ship before it even left the dock. But this isn't the story we're telling. We're telling of a story almost a year before. It was the 24th of March 1911, and the SS Yongala was a ship from the Adelaide Steamship Company, a 3,700-ton vessel captained by William Knight, called in at Mackay en route from Brisbane to Townsville. It was 1:40 p.m. and it steamed out of Mackay Harbour. There were no convicts on this ship, but there were 48 passengers, a crew of 72, and a racehorse named Moonshine. After they left Mackay, the harbour master at Mackay received a report that a terrible tropical cyclone was coming toward them. But there was no radio on the Yongala, which is quite strange. But because they didn't have a radio to contact them, the Yongala sailed straight into the path. By 6:30 in the evening, the Yongala was sighted, battling waves that were mountain high. Between then and the early hours of the next morning, the Yongala sank, with the loss of everybody on board, including poor Moonshine. Over the next few days, just south of Townsville, most of what was on board the ship washed up ashore, including poor Moonshine. However, the wreckage wasn't located. They didn't know where the ship went down, and it wouldn't be till almost 50 years later that they would locate that shipwreck. 1958. It was said to have been located 23 kilometres east of the Cape Bowling Green Lighthouse. Well, the lighthouse is not there anymore. It's been moved to the Sydney Maritime Museum. So you can see it in Sydney now, this particular lighthouse. Well, it clearly did nothing for the ship back in 1911. There's an island called Russell Island, which is pretty much where the lighthouse was, if you wanted to look it up on the map. I did. I tried to find it myself. There's also a company that offers tours to the SS Yongala wreck. It's a diving tour, so it's probably going to set you back a couple of $100, but I'm sure it'd be worth it if you're into that kind of thing. In 1981, it was declared a historic wreck, so as it wouldn't have been brought out of the sea, so they're just leaving it there pretty much as a piece of history. And obviously you can go and swim around it if you like. There was many wrecks I remember as a kid in Queensland when I travelled there on holidays, seeing these wrecks up on the beach, and they'd been left there. But I don't think they've got them around anymore. It was probably an OH&S thing for the local councils. If people were climbing the structures and things like that and killed themselves, or lost body parts, cutting themselves on serrated edges and that kind of thing, they've probably taken them all away now. But it's interesting that the SS Yongala is actually still in the sea, and you're actually able to tour it. A win for historians and diving enthusiasts. But that's not where the story ends. Wouldn't be a ghost ship if it was. There was a story about 10 years after the ship had gone missing. 1923. There was some local fishermen from Bowen and had a small boat and took it off the coast of Holborn Island, near where the SS Yongala would have travelled. They were startled during the night when a ship came past them. Normally a ship going past them wouldn't have bothered them so much, only they recognised immediately which ship it was. And it wasn't meant to be there. It had sunk 10 years earlier. They recognised exactly the ship from its colour and its style, and also due to the fact that it had barnacles all over it, and its masts were down, the funnel was all twisted. It looked as though it had been in a war and come out the other end defeated, but they were all shocked, and their little boat started to move up and down with the waves coming from this ship. There was a few of these fishermen on board, so it wasn't like one guy made up the story. I mean, perhaps they'd all been drinking and thought it was a great tale to tell, but it's a story that many have actually believed. So whether the people back in Bowen decided that the fishermen were telling the truth, who knows? But it's made it this far. 100 years later. There are also a couple of other strange stories that go along with the Yongala. There was a woman who was meant to go on board back in 1911. Her name was Mrs. Lothar, and after the ship had been discovered, the wreck that is, she came forward with her story that she was meant to board, and even got as far as travelling halfway there before she had the most uneasy feeling of her own end had she boarded it. She made the driver turn around and go back home, and did not get on board. It's like she knew, or she was being warned. Her instincts were telling her, do not get on board. And she was right not to. And that isn't the only story. There was another story of a family who was staying in an Eaton hotel west of Mackay. They were also going to board the SS Yongala. They had a kerosene lamp on the table of their room the night before. One of their children pointed at the flame inside. Look at the big ship. The flame had blackened a side of the glass, and the blackness had formed a ship image, which was high upon a large wave. The parents thought at once it was a bad omen, and decided they were not going to travel. However, the ship image turned into another image. It was an image of a girl crying out in distress. which is really strange how this could just appear on a kerosene lamp. But apparently it did. And this face was in turmoil. Well, that was it. Their trip was done. They were not going to board the SS Yongala after that. The next day, the family went into Mackay, probably to see off the SS Yongala, which they wouldn't be boarding. And a strange thing happened. The father was walking along and saw a poster for a touring theatre company, and on the poster was the face of a young girl. He called over his family and they all looked at the poster, and the strangest feeling came over them. It was the face of the girl that they'd seen in the kerosene lamp. Now, upon further investigating with the theatre company, it appeared the girl had boarded the SS Yongala, and the distressed face was most likely that of her perishing at sea. Oh, it's chilling. Terrible and crazy, all of it. I mean, whether these stories that are 100 years old are true or not, geez, it makes you really, crazy. I mean, we hear all the time of people not boarding planes and later finding out that the plane went down and they'd had that feeling not to board, and mediums having visions. I mean, it's quite possible that 100 years ago, people had these premonitions and feelings, and maybe they didn't say anything about it straight away. You don't want to be that person that knew something bad was going to happen and didn't say anything. But back in those days, they wouldn't have been believed anyway. It wasn't really something that was accepted. One thing's for sure, this SS Yongala story is one of the craziest yet. Well, we've done it again. We've found way too many stories to pack into one episode. So stay tuned for the next episode where we do part 2 of Australia's ghost ships, where we've got another 2 ships, and these stories are just way out there. There's just so much information and you can't half tell one of these stories. The twists and turns that I know you guys love too. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you know when part 2 of these Aussie ghost ship ghost stories are coming back.